90% of the poets and philosophers had finished sorting out their clean collars and getting their photographs taken for the passport. She had not left England without a pang, for departure had involved sacrifices. More than anything else in the world, she loved her charming home, Windles, in the county of Hampshire, for so many years the seat of the Hignett family. Windles was as the breath of life to her. Its shady walks, its silver lake, its noble elms, the old grey stone of its walls, these were bound up with her very being. She felt that she belonged to Windles, and Windles to her. Unfortunately, as a matter of cold legal accuracy, it did not. She did but hold it in trust for her son, Eustace, until such time as he should marry and take possession of it himself. There were times when the thought of Eustace marrying and bringing a strange woman to Windles chilled Mrs. Hignett to her very marrow. Happily, her firm policy of keeping her son permanently under her eye at home, and never permitting him to have a speech with a female below the age of 50, had averted the peril up to now. Eustace had accompanied his mother to America. It was his faint snores, which she could hear in the adjoining room, as, having bathed and dressed, she went down the hall to where breakfast awaited her. She smiled tolerantly. She had never desired to convert her son to her own early-rising habits, for apart from not allowing him to call his soul his own, she was an indulgent mother. Eustace would get up at 9:30, long after she'd finished breakfast, read her correspondence, and started her duties for the day. Breakfast was on the table in the sitting-room, a modest meal of rolls, porridge, and imitation coffee. Beside the pot containing this hell brew was a little pile of letters. Mrs. Hignett opened them as she ate. The majority were from disciples, and dealt with matters of purely theosophical interest. There was an invitation from the Butterfly Club, asking her to be the guest of honour at their weekly dinner. There was a letter from her brother Mallaby, Sir Mallaby Marlowe, the eminent London lawyer, saying that his son, Sam, of whom she had never approved, would be in New York shortly, passing through on his way back to England, and hoping that she would see something of him. Altogether a dull mail. Mrs. Hignett skimmed through it without interest, setting aside one or two of the letters for Eustace, who acted as her unpaid secretary to answer later in the day. She had just risen from the table when there was a sound of voices in the hall, and presently the domestic staff, a gaunt Irish lady of advanced years, entered the room. "Ma'am, there was a gentleman." Mrs. Hignett was annoyed. Her mornings were sacred. "Didn't you tell him I was not to be disturbed?" "I did not. I loosed him into the parlour." The staff remained for a moment in melancholy silence, then resumed. "He says he's your nephew. His name's Marlowe." Mrs. Hignett experienced no diminution of her annoyance. She had not seen her nephew Sam for 10 years, and would have been willing to extend the period. She remembered him as an untidy small boy, who once or twice, during his school holidays, had disturbed the cloistral peace of Windles with his beastly presence. However, blood being thicker than water, and all that sort of thing, she supposed she would have to give him 5 minutes. She went into the sitting-room and found there a young man who looked more or less like all other young men, though perhaps rather fitter than most. He'd grown a good deal since she'd last met him, as men so often do between the ages of 15 and 25, and was now about 6 feet in height, about 40 inches round the chest, and in weight about 13 stone. He had a brown and amiable face, marred at the moment by an expression of discomfort, somewhat akin to that of a cat in a strange alley. "Hello, Aunt Adeline," he said awkwardly. "Well, Samuel?" said Mrs. Hignett. There was a pause. Mrs. Hignett, who was not fond of young men, and disliked having her mornings broken into, was thinking that he had not improved in the slightest degree since their last meeting, and Sam, who imagined that he'd long since grown to man's estate and put off childish things, was embarrassed to discover that his aunt still affected him as of old. That is to say, she made him feel as if he'd omitted to shave, and, in addition to that, had swallowed some drug which had caused him to swell unpleasantly, particularly about the hands and feet. "Jolly morning," said Sam perseveringly. "So I imagine. I've not been out yet." "Thought I'd look in and see how you were." "That was very kind of you. The morning is my busy time, but yes, that was very kind of you." There was another pause. "How do you like America?" said Sam. "I dislike it exceedingly." "Yes? Well, of course some people do. Prohibition and all that. Personally, it doesn't affect me. I can take it or leave it alone. I like America myself," said Sam. "I've had a wonderful time. Everyone has treated me like a rich uncle. I've been in Detroit, you know, and they practically gave me the city and asked me if I'd like another to take home in my pocket. Never saw anything like it. I might have been the missing heir. I think America's the greatest invention on record." "And what brought you to America?" said Mrs. Hignett, unmoved by this rhapsody.
"Oh, I came over to play golf, in a tournament, you know."
"Surely at your age," said Mrs. Hignett disapprovingly, "you could be better occupied. You spend your whole time playing golf?"
"Oh, no, I play cricket a bit and shoot a bit, and I swim a good lot, and I still play football occasionally."
"I wonder your father does not insist on your doing some useful work."
"He is beginning to harp on the subject, rather. I suppose I should take a stab at it sooner or later. Father says I ought to get married, too."
"He's perfectly right."
"I suppose old Eustace will be getting hitched up one of these days," said Sam.
Mrs. Hignett started violently. "Why do you say that?"
"Eh?
What makes you say that?"
"Oh, well, he's a romantic sort of fellow. Writes poetry and all that."
"There's no likelihood at all of Eustace marrying. He is of a shy and retiring temperament, and sees few women. He is almost a recluse."
Sam was aware of this, and had frequently regretted it. He'd always been fond of his cousin in that half-amused and rather patronising way in which men of thews and sinews are fond of the weaker brethren, who run more to pallor and intellect. And he'd always felt that if Eustace had not had to retire to Windles to spend his life with a woman whom from his earliest years he'd always considered the empress of the washouts, much might have been made of him. Both at school and at Oxford, Eustace had been, if not a sport, at least a decidedly cheery old bean. Sam remembered Eustace at school, breaking gas globes with a slipper, in a positively rollicking manner. He remembered him up at Oxford, playing up to him manfully at the piano on the occasion when he'd done that imitation of Frank Tinney, which had been such a hit at the Trinity Smoker. Yes, Eustace had had the makings of a pretty sound egg, and it was too bad that he'd allowed his mother to coop him up down in the country, miles away from anywhere.
"Eustace is returning to England on Saturday," said Mrs. Hignett. She spoke a little wistfully. She'd not been parted from her son since he'd come down from Oxford, and she would have liked to keep him with her till the end of her lecturing tour. That, however, was out of the question. It was imperative that, while she was away, he should be at Windles. Nothing would have induced her to leave the place at the mercy of servants, who might trample over the flower-beds, scratch the polished floors, and forget to cover up the canary at night.
"He sails on the Atlantic."
"That's splendid," said Sam. "I'm sailing on the Atlantic myself. I'll go down to the office and see if we can't have a stateroom together."
"But where's he going to live when he gets to England?"
"Where's he going to live? Why, at Windles, of course. Where else?"
"But I thought you were letting Windles for the summer."
Mrs. Hignett stared.
"Letting Windles?"
She spoke as one might address a lunatic.
"What put that extraordinary idea into your head? I thought Father said something about your letting the place to some American. Nothing of the kind."
It seemed to Sam that his aunt spoke somewhat vehemently, even snappishly, in correcting what was a perfectly natural mistake. He could not know that the subject of letting Windles for the summer was one which had long since begun to infuriate Mrs. Hignett. People had certainly asked her to let Windles. In fact, people had pestered her. There was a rich fat man, an American named Bennett, whom she'd met just before sailing at her brother's house in London. Invited down to Windles for the day, Mr. Bennett had fallen in love with the place, and had begged her to name her own price. Not content with this, he'd pursued her with his pleadings by means of the wireless telegraph while she was on the ocean, and had not given up the struggle even when she reached New York. She'd not been in America 2 days when there had arrived a Mr. Mortimer, bosom friend of Mr. Bennett, carrying on the matter where the other had left off. For a whole week, Mr. Mortimer had tried to induce her to reconsider her decision, and had only stopped because he'd had to leave for England himself to join his friend. and even then